Hey everyone, welcome to this video. I'm really bummed that we can't meet in person tonight due to the poor air quality, but I'm also really excited for what this gives us the opportunity to do. So before we dive into this video, I want you to grab a few quick things. First, make sure to grab a Bible and open it up to Genesis 12. That's where we're going to be today. Second, if you are a parent and you're watching this video without your student, go grab him. And if you're a student and you're watching this video without your parent, go grab him. The idea for this video is that students and parents can sit and talk about God together and hopefully learn something from each other as we break down God's Word together. So make sure you grab all those things before you start the rest of the video. Feel free to pause if you need to go grab something. With that being said, let's get right into it. Awesome. Assuming that you grabbed your Bible and your parent or student, we're going to dive right into Genesis 12. But before we do, I want to touch on some of the context for this story and kind of where it comes from. See, the beginning of the book of Genesis deals over and over again with big, global sweeping things. We have the creation of everything in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In Genesis 3, we have sin's entrance into the world. Moving on to Genesis 5, we see a genealogy for this guy named Noah who survives this massive flood that impacts the entire world, right? In Genesis 11, we see the Tower of Babel. Everything in the book of Genesis has been these big, sweeping global events. But then Genesis 12 happens, and kind of the scope of the entire book begins to narrow. Rather than looking at the entire planet and focusing on everyone all the time, Genesis 12 transitions us to look at one man and his family. It's where we narrow in on Abram, who eventually will become the father of Isaac, who eventually will become the father of Jacob, who is Israel. And the nation of Israel is going to begin with him. And really the whole Old Testament is going to focus primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on Israel. And that narrowing, again, really begins here in Genesis 12, specifically with this promise that God gives to Abram. Genesis 12, 1-3 says this: "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" So in Genesis 12, God gives Abram an incredible promise. He promises to bless him and to curse anyone who despises him or makes him his enemies. However, in order to receive this blessing, Abram has to give up some really important things. He has to leave behind his country. He has to leave behind his people. He has to leave behind the household of his father. He leaves behind family and familiarity and life. And so as we think about this story, I want you to have a conversation. Students and parents, I want you to think about this. What makes you, you? For parents, when you were in high school or when you were in junior high, what is one thing or activity you were involved in that you built your personality around? Maybe it was a type of movie you liked. Maybe it was an activity you did. What made you, you in high school? And for you who are junior hires or high schoolers, what makes you, you now? What is the pieces of you that you think are most important? The things that if anyone is talking about you, they have to bring up. What makes you, you? Take a moment and talk about that before we move on to the next section. Pause the video if you need. Awesome. Hopefully you got the opportunity to learn a little bit more about each other. I was thinking about my answer for this question. What are things that made me me? And one that came to my mind that was interesting is when I was in college, I was really into one chapter of a book, and that chapter title was an onion. And I talked about it so much that when I graduated college, I got 3 onion-related gifts. It was weird. It's something I built my personality around was onions, weirdly enough. But when we think about these things that are central to us, these things that we hold near and dear to our hearts, sometimes it can be hard to imagine what our lives would be like without him. See, God is asking Abram to leave behind everything he's ever known, in the hopes that maybe someday he'll be able to take Abram to a place that's better. But Abram chooses to trust God. There's not much deliberation in the book of Genesis in Genesis 12. He doesn't sit around and ask questions to God. No, at least in Genesis 12, he dives right in, right? Starting in verse 4, right after the promise, we see this. "So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came into the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abram immediately trusts God. At least from what we see in Genesis 12, God tells Abram to go, and so he goes, right? As parents who are watching this, I'm sure you've talked to your students about first-time obedience, and Abram definitely shows that here. He trusts that God is who he said he is, and that God's plan for his life is better, so he goes and he does it. See, as we look at our own lives, sometimes God's plans don't always make sense to us in the moment. There's times when we are called to do something, and all that we can see before us is a land of unknowns. We don't know where God is leading us next or what he has for us. And so one thing I want you to talk about, parents and students, when is a time in your life when you had to trust God, even when you couldn't see what he had for you next? When is a time when you had to step out in faith, trusting that God would catch you wherever he might have led you? Take a moment, talk about that. Feel free to pause the video. We'll get back into it soon. Trust can be a terrifying thing. But as we look at our lives, I'm sure that we trust more things than we might realize every day. We trust our cars to start in the morning when we presume that we're going to work. We trust people in our lives to keep our secrets or to provide us with friendship. We trust every day. But we see in this story that Abram trusts a God who is worthy of his trust, a God who is faithful. See, God's going to go on to fulfill these promises in Abram. He's going to go on to make him into a great nation and really to bring about all these blessings he brings up in Genesis 12. But before we end, I really want to highlight Genesis 12:3 to talk about the greatest blessing that God gives, not just to Abram, but through Abram. See, in Genesis 12:3, there's this little line, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." That makes sense. But then God includes this one little add-on at the end of this blessing. "And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Abram plays an integral role in the story of the gospel. See, because of Abram's obedience here, through Abram's faith in God, Jesus is going to enter into the world. God is going to use Abram's line to fulfill this promise that he brings about in Genesis 3, that eventually the serpent will bite the heel of the son of the woman and he will crush his head. Jesus is going to bring about that death to death itself. Now, God hasn't given us all the promises that he gives to Abram. We aren't going to be able to be like the great-great-great-great-great-grandparents of his inevitable son entering the world. That's not our role. But God still has incredible things that he wants us to do. He's called us to build his kingdom, to be a part of his mission in the world. And so the last question I want to leave you with, that I want students and parents, I want you to talk about, is simply this. How has God called you to build his kingdom? What role do you think you can play in the story of God's message and his ministry and his mission in the world? What is God calling you to do to make his name known? What can you do? God has given us the opportunity to make his name known and to build his kingdom. He's given you gifts and passions and desires and talents and resources that you can use to continue his ministry in the world. It's an exciting thing that God's called us to, but just like Abram, sometimes God calls us to give something up. He calls us to cast off pieces of our identity, things that are near and dear to our hearts. For Abram, it was leaving behind the land he once knew, leaving behind his family. For you, maybe it's giving up some sins in your life, things that are holding you back from serving God well. Maybe he's calling you to sacrifice your time, your hobbies, your talents, your resources to build his kingdom. But the reason that Abram is right in following God is the same reason that we can follow God today, because his God is faithful. Our God is faithful. We might be living lives that are very different than Abram. We aren't living at the same time period. We aren't living in the same place. So many things in our stories are going to look different than Abram's, but one thing remains constant. We worship the same faithful God who's going to bring about these blessings in Abram's life. In the same way that God is faithful in Abram's life, he's faithful in our lives as well. So trust him, follow him, live for him. not just as an individual, but as a family. Come together and ask yourself, how can we build God's kingdom? How can I live my life trusting Him better? Well, I really hope that this video and this conversation that we got to have is helpful. I hope it allows you the opportunity to think more deeply about discipleship and following Jesus and what that might mean. And above all, I hope that you got to see a picture of God, a God who is faithful, who is worthy of trust, who, yes, calls us to a high standard, but a God who loves us deeply and wants to bless His people. On a lesson note, I really hope that I get to see you next week at Youth Group, that we're able to get back into our normal rhythms soon. But until then, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. I'll see you all soon. Take care. Have a good one. Peace.